I wasn't expecting anything remarkable that Tuesday morning. My van was loaded with the usual supplies: new fence panels, a rusted toolbox, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and a client address scribbled on the back of a fuel receipt. The job came in last minute, booked by a woman named Elaine, who'd just moved into a weathered 2-story house on the edge of town. All she'd said over the phone was that her fence was embarrassingly crooked and that she'd prefer it be fixed. Before her sister's visit that weekend, I almost passed on the job. I had bigger projects pending, but something about her voice made me say yes. It wasn't flirtation or urgency. It was steadiness, clarity. I guess I was craving that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her house wasn't hard to find. It sat behind a row of leaning oak trees, like it had been nudged off the main road and just decided to stay out of sight. The fence really was in bad shape, warped planks leaning like exhausted soldiers, latches rusted solid, and vines growing wild between the gaps. But the yard was clean. Someone had taken time to trim the shrubs and sweep the path leading to the porch. That contrast caught my eye. Broken fence, but cared for surroundings. That said something about her already. I knocked. The door opened halfway. She stood there barefoot, wearing a loose shirt tucked into old jeans and her hair tied back in a bandana like she'd been unpacking all morning. She looked older than I expected. Not old, not by any stretch, but seasoned. A face that had known sun and laughter and some storms too. She smiled, and it was genuine, not one of those tight-lipped, overly polite smiles people offer contractors. "Fence guy?" she asked. "That's me," I said. And just like that, we began. The work was straightforward enough, at least it was supposed to be. But the deeper I went into the repair, the more I noticed nails that had been hammered in by someone who clearly didn't know what they were doing. Patched up sections that told stories of temporary fixes and quick cover-ups, like the fence had been holding itself together just enough to get by. I told her I'd need a couple of days if she wanted it to last. She said that was fine. Offered me coffee without asking how I took it. It came black, no sugar, and somehow she got it right. She didn't hover, but she didn't disappear either. While I worked, she'd float in and out, sometimes watering plants, sometimes repainting a wooden chair on the porch, sometimes just sitting with a book and looking over the edge of the pages to ask me random questions. "What's the strangest thing you've ever found behind someone's fence?" she asked once. I told her about the time I found an entire collection of antique glass bottles buried in a backyard. She laughed, said she hoped I didn't find anything that interesting. "Back there?" "I've only got regrets and snails," she said. I didn't know how to respond, so I chuckled and kept hammering. But that phrase stuck with me. On the second morning, I arrived just after 7. The sun was still warming up the day, and the grass was dewy beneath my boots. She was already outside, barefoot again, crouched near the fence with a bowl of something in her hands. When I got closer, I saw she was feeding a stray cat. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Elaine said, not looking up. "But she shows up every morning like she does." I nodded, not sure if she was talking about the cat or something else entirely. That's how it was with her simple statements, wrapped in deeper meanings, left hanging in the air like unpicked fruit. That morning passed in quiet work. The new panels went up straighter than I'd expected, and the gate finally swung without screeching like a haunted door. Around mid-morning, she brought me a sandwich and sat on the porch while I ate. We talked more this time about her move, about how she used to live in the city but got tired of elevators and constant noise. "I wanted to hear myself think again," she said. "Turns out it's a lot louder in here than I remembered," she added, tapping her temple. I told her I understood that more than most. I wasn't trying to be deep. I really did get it. Too many years on the road, too many projects that felt like placeholders. I was tired too. Then she asked me something unexpected. "How long have you been doing this?" I said over a decade. "And before that?" "8." She asked. I hesitated. Told her I used to work in an office, in logistics. That I left when my marriage fell apart and needed something I could build with my hands. She didn't ask for more, just nodded and looked at the cat again. That's how the days unfolded, simple, slow, and somehow meaningful. No confessions. No obvious flirtation. It's just shared moments that began to stretch a little longer each time. A few more questions. A few more stories. I found myself arriving earlier, leaving later. The fence, almost done, began to feel like a reason to stay longer rather than a task to finish. On the third day, just as I was packing up tools for what I thought would be the last time, she walked up to me quietly. Her face was calm, but her eyes were searching. She stood beside the finished fence, ran her hand along the smooth wood, and then looked up at me. "Would you choose me even at 53?" she asked softly. "I'm not kidding." Then she smiled like someone bracing for impact, but hoping to fly. And that's when everything changed. For a moment, I didn't move. Her words hung in the air, heavier than they had any right to be, suspended between us like a question neither of us had asked until now, even though every quiet moment, da-da-da-da-da, every lingering glance, every shared coffee had been slowly building toward it. "Would you choose me, even at 53? She said it like she already knew the answer, like she dared the question only after convincing herself of the worst possible outcome. But her eyes, those sharp ocean gray eyes, told a different story. They searched mine not with desperation, but with vulnerability. The kind that's rarely spoken aloud by someone who has lived long enough to know that not all hearts stay tender forever. Her smile that followed, small and tight, wasn't a challenge. It was a shield. I hadn't expected that kind of moment. Not here, not with her. Not while I was wiping sawdust off my hands and thinking about whether the new gate latch needed a second coat of sealant. But life doesn't schedule these moments, does it? They don't wait until you're dressed right or holding the right words. They just happen raw and sudden and real. And this one had cracked something open inside me I didn't even realize. Had been closed. I could have answered her immediately. I could have said yes, or made a joke, or even pretended not to understand. But something told me that whatever I said now would echo further than just the space between us on her patchy lawn. So I did what I've learned to do when things matter. I paused. I looked at her, not just her face, but the way her shoulders tensed slightly as if bracing for cold water. The way her fingers curled loosely against her thighs like she didn't want to seem like she cared too much. And the way her breath hitched, just slightly. When I finally stepped forward, I told her I wasn't expecting to be asked anything like that today, and that if I was being honest, I hadn't let myself think about it until this second. But now that she had asked, I couldn't imagine saying anything except yes. Not because she was kind or smart, or beautiful, though she was all of those, but because being around her made me feel like I had a future that didn't have to look like my past. I told her that I liked the way she moved through her day, the way she looked at the world like it still held secrets worth uncovering, and the way she never needed to fill the silence with noise. That even when she teased or asked strange questions, it never felt like small talk, it felt like something bigger. It's like an invitation to show up as myself, completely. She didn't cry. I don't know if I expected her to. Instead, she exhaled. Slowly, like someone finally letting go of a breath they've held far too long. She reached out and touched my hand. Not grabbed, not squeezed. Just touched, and it was the gentlest contact I'd felt in years. Then she said she had to check on the bread in the oven and walked back inside without another word. That was her way. No declarations, no promises, just space. Space for both of us to sit with the weight of what had just passed between us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I didn't leave right away. I sat down on the edge of her porch and looked at the fence I had just finished. It stood there, straight and sturdy, cleaner than the one that had been here before, but with a few visible knots and imperfections that I had decided not to sand away, not because I was lazy, but because they reminded me of her house, of her hands, of her real things. Had rough edges. The best ones did. After a while, the door creaked open again. She came out holding 2 mugs of tea, not coffee this time, and handed me one like nothing had happened. We sat together in silence, sipping slowly as the breeze moved through the trees above us. scattering sunlight across the porch floor. Eventually, she spoke again, not about love or age or what would come next, but about a cardinal that had been nesting in her backyard for 3 seasons now. She said the bird kept coming back, even after the tree it favored was struck by lightning last spring. It had rebuilt its nest higher up this time, in the same tree, like it trusted it would still hold. I didn't say anything, but I understood. The rest of the day passed without fanfare. I loaded my tools, double-checked the hinges, and promised to drop off an extra can of sealant the following week. She didn't walk me to my truck, but I caught her watching me from the window as I backed out of the drive. When I lifted my hand in a wave, she returned it small, slow, but with unmistakable intent. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a see-you-soon. The next few days were quieter than I expected. I kept myself busy with smaller jobs, things that didn't take up much time, but gave my hand something to do. But no matter where I went, she was there in the way someone looked out a window, in the sound of leaves rustling against old paint, in the taste of plain tea. I now found myself brewing each morning instead of coffee. Didn't call. I wanted to, but something told me she needed space too. Not distance, just time. To sit with the words she'd let loose. To decide whether she still wanted them hanging in the air now that I'd caught them. On the 4th day, she texted me. Just one line, "The cardinal's back. You should come see it." I drove over that evening. No tools, no thermos, just me.
Error.
Porch light was on again, and the smell of something sweet drifted through the air. Maybe cinnamon, maybe apples. She didn't open the door this time. I didn't knock. I walked around back, through the side gate I had fixed, and found her standing beneath the tree. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and smiled, not a greeting this time, but something deeper. Something like recognition. We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the cardinal flutter from branch to branch, as if it too was unsure where to land. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't in a rush to finish anything. For a moment I didn't move. Her words hung in the air, heavier than they had any right to be. Suspended between us like a question neither of us had asked until now, even though every quiet moment, every lingering glance, every shared coffee had been slowly building toward it. Would you choose me even at 53? She said it like she already knew the answer. Like she dared the question only after convincing herself of the worst possible outcome. But her eyes, those sharp ocean gray eyes, told a different story. They searched mine, not with desperation, but with vulnerability. It's a kind that's rarely spoken aloud by someone who has lived long enough to know that not all hearts stay tender forever. Her smile that followed, small and tight, wasn't a challenge. It was a shield. I hadn't expected that kind of moment. Not here, not with her. Not while I was wiping sawdust off my hands and thinking about whether the new gate latch needed a second coat of sealant. But life doesn't schedule these moments, does it? They don't wait until you're dressed right or holding the right words. They just happen raw and sudden and real. I think this one had cracked something open inside me I didn't even realize. Had been closed. I could have answered her immediately. Could have said yes, or made a joke, or even pretended not to understand. But something told me that whatever I said now would echo further than just the space between us on her patchy lawn. So I did what I've learned to do when things matter. I paused. I looked at her, not just her face, but the way her shoulders tensed slightly, as if bracing for cold water. The way her fingers curled loosely against her thighs like she didn't want to seem like she cared too much. And the way her breath hitched, just slightly. When I finally stepped forward, I told her I wasn't expecting to be asked anything like that today, and that if I was being honest, I hadn't let myself think about it until this second. But now that she had asked, I couldn't imagine saying anything except yes. Not because she was kind or smart, or beautiful though she was, all of those, but because being around her made me feel like I had a future that didn't have to look like my past. I told her that I liked the way she moved through her day, the way she looked at the world like it still held secrets worth uncovering, and the way she never needed to fill the silence with noise. That even when she teased or asked strange questions, it never felt like small talk, it felt like something bigger. It's like an invitation to show up as myself completely. She didn't cry. I don't know if I expected her to. Instead, she exhaled. Slowly, like someone finally letting go of a breath they've held far too long, she reached out and touched my hand. Not grabbed, not squeezed. Just touched, and it was the gentlest contact I'd felt in years. Then she said she had to check on the bread in the oven and walked back inside without another word. That was her way. No declarations, no promises, just space. Space for both of us to sit with the weight of what had just passed between us. Didn't leave right away. I sat down on the edge of her porch and looked at the fence I had just finished. It stood there, straight and sturdy, cleaner than the one that had been here before, but with a few visible knots and imperfections that I had decided not to sand away. Not because I was lazy, but because they reminded me of her house, of her. Hands of her. Real things had rough edges. The best ones did. After a while, the door creaked open again. She came out holding 2 mugs of tea, not coffee this time, and handed me one like nothing had happened. We sat together in silence, sipping slowly as the breeze moved through the trees above us, scattering sunlight across the porch floor. Eventually, she spoke again, not about love or age or what would come next, but about a cardinal that had been nesting in her backyard for 3 seasons now. She said the bird kept coming back, even after the tree it favored was struck by lightning last spring. That it had rebuilt its nest higher up this time, in the same tree, like it trusted it would still hold. I didn't say anything, but I understood. The rest of the day passed without fanfare. Loaded my tools, double-checked the hinges, and promised to drop off an extra can of sealant the following week. She didn't walk me to my truck, but I caught her watching me from the window as I backed out of the drive, and when I lifted my hand in a wave, she returned it small, slow, but with unmistakable intent. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a see-you-soon. The next few days were quieter than I expected. I kept myself busy with smaller jobs, things that didn't take up much time but gave my hands something to do. But no matter where I went, she was there in the way someone looked out a window. In the sound of leaves rustling against old paint, in the taste of plain tea, I now found myself brewing each morning instead of coffee. Didn't call. I wanted to, but something told me she needed space too. Not distance, just time. To sit with the words she'd let loose. To decide whether she still wanted them hanging in the air now that I'd caught them. On the 4th day, she texted me. Just one line. The cardinal's back. You should come see it. I drove over that evening. No tools, no thermos. Just me.
Error.
Porch light was on again, and the smell of something sweet drifted through the air. Maybe cinnamon, maybe apples. She didn't open the door this time. I didn't knock. I walked around back, through the side gate I had fixed, and found her standing beneath the tree. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and smiled, not a greeting this time, but something deeper. Something like recognition. We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the cardinal flutter from branch to branch, as if it too was unsure where to land. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't in a rush to finish anything. Air that evening carried the faintest bite of the coming season. It wasn't cold yet, not enough for jackets or scarves, but enough to draw your arms a little closer to your chest when the sun dipped below the horizon. The cardinal darted between the limbs of the half-bare tree as though it knew it didn't have much time before the winds changed. I stood there beside Elaine, still not touching, still not saying anything, but feeling more connected than I had in years.
But
It wasn't about attraction anymore. It had come and gone like a summer spark and settled into something quieter, deeper. Something that didn't need grand gestures to make its point. It was in the way she breathed beside me, steady and unhurried. In the way she tilted her head slightly toward mine, not enough to lean, just enough to suggest comfort. That was how things moved with her. Incremental, intentional, always genuine. She eventually stepped away from the tree and motioned for me to follow her back to the porch. The porch lights were dim, casting a honey-colored glow across the floorboards and onto the 2 wooden chairs that had become ours without us ever deciding they were. She handed me a mug of tea again. Not my Nand. I accepted it like it was a habit we'd always shared. The silence stretched between us like a familiar blanket. It didn't need filling. It was enough that we were there in each other's presence, watching the night settle in like it. Had every right to. It struck me then just how different this all was from anything I'd known before. Relationships in my past had been hurried, pressed into existence by youth or obligation or loneliness, masked as chemistry. They started loud, burned hot, and fizzled out under the weight of unspoken expectations. But this thing with Elaine, didn't demand a label or timeline, just asked me to show up, to be honest, and to stay as long as it felt right. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about where it might lead or how long it would last. I was just glad to be in it. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't have any job scheduled, yet I found myself making coffee and walking out to my truck before the sky had fully shaken off the stars. It wasn't planned, but my hands moved like they knew where they were going. By the time I pulled into Elaine's driveway, the neighborhood was still quiet. The only sound was the rustle of leaves under my tires. I felt like a teenager again, showing up uninvited, hoping she wouldn't mind. But when I reached her porch, I saw the curtain shift slightly, and then the door opened. Just a crack, just enough for her to say, "Come in." Inside, her home was warm, cozy in a lived-in way. Books scattered on side tables and knit throw draped over the back of the couch. A faint smell of cinnamon and wood polish lingering in the air. I noticed a photograph on the wall near the kitchen, her as a young woman, probably in her 20s, standing on a beach, hair windblown, grinning wide like she owned the world. There was someone beside her, a man I didn't recognize. But the photo had that sepia glow that suggested the moment was long gone. I didn't ask. She didn't offer. She poured me tea, sat across from me, and for a while we simply existed. In the same space. It's funny how quickly comfort can settle in when you stop resisting it. Eventually, we started talking about small things mostly. She told me about a neighbor who always walked his dog at 5:17 p.m. on the dot, how she'd never seen him smile. I told her about a roofing job I did once where I found an old wedding ring tucked inside a wall cavity, wrapped in cloth like someone had hidden it deliberately. We both wondered aloud what kind of story that might have been, and in that wondering, we found our rhythm again. Later, I offered to help her with some chores, not because she asked, but because I wanted to be useful. I cleared out some branches from her gutter, repaired a hinge on the back door, and fixed a window screen that had been flapping loose for weeks. She followed me around for a bit, watching, occasionally passing me tools, but mostly just observing. At one point she laughed and said, "You're like a one-man handyman, Army." I didn't say it then, but I liked the way she said "my handyman." It's like I'd already become part of the scenery she didn't want to change as the day wound down. We ended up back by the fence, the one I had repaired just a few days earlier. It looked strong, reliable, a small monument to beginnings. She stood with her hand resting on the top rail, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was searching for something just out of view. I asked her what she was thinking. She paused, then said that I never thought I'd want someone around this often again. Not at this stage. I figured I'd outgrown all that. She looked down at her hand, then back at me. But here you are. Wanted to tell her that I hadn't expected this either, that I'd spent years convincing myself that some people just weren't meant for lasting connections. That real love was for the lucky, or the young, or the endlessly patient. But then I met her. In every quiet moment, every shared glance, every day that began with tea instead of coffee slowly unraveled that lie. I didn't say all of that, not yet. Instead, I reached out and rested my hand on hers, just briefly, just enough. That small act, we understood each other. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the freshly stained wood of the fence. The cardinal returned, chirping once before disappearing into the branches above. The air cooled again, just slightly. She didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask her if I could. But when she opened the door and didn't move aside, I knew that what we were building now wasn't just between posts and panels. It was inside both of us. The following days slipped into each other without resistance, like pages in a well-thumbed book that refused to stay closed. I hadn't expected to return so soon, but something about Elaine's presence, her calm, her candor, her quiet gravity seemed to draw me in as naturally as breath follows thought. I told myself I was just finishing up a few last repairs, that the gate needed another adjustment, and that one of the corner posts wasn't sitting quite right. But truthfully, the work had long been done. What I kept coming back for was less about the fence and more about the way she made space for me in her world without needing to say it aloud. Each morning, she left her door unlocked by the time I arrived. There was always a pot of tea steeping on the counter, not because she assumed I wanted it, but because it was already part of her rhythm. I began to notice the small things she did without thinking, how she folded dish towels a certain way, how she always opened the windows just slightly, no matter the weather, how she hummed a melody that had no pattern while watering the herbs on her kitchen sill. These details rooted themselves in me quietly, taking hold where louder memories once lived. It wasn't all perfect. Some days we said little, not out of discomfort, but because the silence between us had become its own kind of conversation. I learned to read the lines on her face, to catch the brief flicker of emotion. When she stared too long at the family photo above her mantel or the newspaper clippings tucked into her kitchen drawer. She didn't talk much about her past, but I understood enough. The photo of her with the man on the beach disappeared from the wall one day, and I never asked why. I figured she didn't want to explain it, and I respected that. Some memories were like old woodment, to be kept intact, not sanded down. One afternoon, as we sat beneath the maple tree in her backyard, she told me she had never really expected to be this alone at this point in her life. It wasn't bitterness in her voice, just acceptance. She had lived through chapters of companionship, loss, reinvention, and quiet independence. You get to a point, she said, where you stop planning and just start tending. That phrase stuck with me, start tending. That was what we were doing, I realized. Tending to something neither of us had anticipated, but both of us had begun to believe in. The town's rhythm slowed as summer gave way to the first hints of fall. The heat softened, shadows lengthened, and the air began to carry a crispness that promised change. I found myself showing up not just in the mornings, but sometimes later in the day, helping her with whatever needed doing. We cleaned out her garage, patched the back porch railing, repainted a shutter that had faded to dull gray. Each task felt like another stitch in the fabric we were slowly weaving together. We didn't talk about what this was or where it was going. We didn't need to. The understanding between us was quieter than words and far more certain. There was one evening, though, that marked a shift. She had invited me to stay for dinner. We ate by candlelight, not out of romance, but because the power had gone out briefly after a tree limb knocked a line down nearby. The flickering light softened her face, made her seem both younger and more timeless, like she had stepped out of a dream I hadn't realized I'd been having for years. We laughed over nothing in particular, about how she'd nearly burned the rice and how I couldn't open a stubborn jar of pickles without nearly breaking the counter. But under the laughter, there was something else, an awareness of the quiet between each smile, a pull that had grown stronger since the day she asked if I'd choose her at 5'3". After we finished eating, she brought out a stack of old records. Her fingers moved carefully through them, pausing over covers with worn edges and names I only half recognized. She picked one and placed it on an old turntable in the corner of the room. The music crackled to life, soft and slow, a voice like velvet pouring through the speakers. She didn't ask me to dance. She didn't need to. She just stood up, crossed to where I was sitting, and extended her hand with a look that asked, "Will you meet me here?" And I did. I stood and placed my hand in hers, and we moved together in small circles, barely swaying, just enough to feel the rhythm of something neither of us had wanted to name. Her head rested briefly on my shoulder. My hand found the small of her back. We didn't speak. The song ended, and we stood there for a moment longer than necessary before she stepped away and smiled. That same shielded, searching smile I had first seen the day we met. I knew then that something had changed, not suddenly, but undeniably. Whatever hesitation had lingered was beginning to give way, and the pieces of her that had been hidden in shadow were slowly stepping into the light. That night, I didn't stay over. I kissed her hand at the doorway, something that surprised even me, and she let her thumb graze the edge of my palm before letting go. "Drive safe," she said, and I nodded, knowing that I would return again, not because there was more to fix, but because this was where I was supposed to be, driving home. I thought about how love doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it builds like the rising of a tide, pulling at the edges of your life until you look up and realize you're already surrounded. With Elaine, it wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was in the repetition, in the quiet. Tea, the repaired shutters, the dance in the dark, the silence we never felt the need to fill. It was in the fact that she asked me if I'd choose her at 53 and trusted me enough to hear the answer. And the truth was, I already had. The mornings began to feel different after that night. It's not dramatically so, not in the way you wake from a dream and everything has changed, but in the way light shifts just a little through the trees, casting softer shadows across familiar places. When I woke the next day, I didn't reach for my phone or plan my route out of habit. Instead, I sat by the window for a moment, letting the quiet fill me. And I thought about her, not just Elaine's face or her voice, but the scent of cinnamon. Clinging to the sleeves of her sweater, the way she hummed under her breath when her hands were busy, and the way her gaze held yours when she was asking something she didn't want to repeat. She had become more than someone I'd grown fond. She had become a rhythm in my life, a pulse I was slowly sinking to. By the time I arrived at her place later that morning, the clouds were thick in the sky, low and heavy with that peculiar tension that always precedes an autumn rain. The air smelled like wet earth and change. I found her on the porch, curled into the old chair with a blanket around her legs and a notebook in her lap. She wasn't writing, just holding the pen as if waiting for her thoughts to make themselves clear. When she saw me, she didn't call out or rise to greet me. She simply smiled in that quiet way of hers and shifted her legs slightly to the side, leaving space for me to sit. I did. We didn't say much at first. There was something sacred about the silence between us that morning, as if words would only crowd the air rather than add anything meaningful. I sipped the tea she handed Mil. It's chamomile today, soft and grounding, and listened to the rustling trees and distant call of crows. Eventually she spoke, her voice low and deliberate, telling me she'd found an old letter tucked into one of her books the night before. It was something she had written to herself years ago, during a time when she felt adrift and disconnected. The letter wasn't dramatic, but it was honest, full of the kind of truths people usually hide from the world. She told me she cried. After reading it, it's not out of sadness, but because she realized she no longer felt that way. Something had shifted. Something had healed. She didn't say that shift was me, and I didn't ask her to. But in the way she glanced at me afterward, there was something unspoken that passed between us like a whispered answer to a question we hadn't asked in days. I wanted to reach for her hand, to say something equally intimate, but instead, I just leaned back in the chair and let my shoulder rest against hers. The contact was small, almost accidental, but we both knew it wasn't. It was a statement. A choice. The rain came softly at first, brushing the edges of the porch like fingertips testing for warmth. We stayed outside anyway, wrapped in our quiet. Cocoon while the world around us blurred and softened. She laughed once when a breeze carried a few stray drops onto her notebook, and without thinking, I pulled my jacket off and draped it around her shoulders. She didn't protest. She didn't even thank me. She just leaned a little closer, her head resting gently against my arm. And together we listened to the rhythm of the rain as if it had been composed just for us. Later that afternoon, the storm deepened. Thunder rolled lazily across the sky, and the kind of downpour that makes everything smell cleaner settled in. We moved indoors, barefoot and damp, leaving behind the mugs and blankets and rain-slicked porch. Inside, the house felt smaller but warmer, like the walls had pulled in closer around us in solidarity. Elaine lit a candle on the kitchen table and set about making soup with the kind of graceful efficiency that made it feel like a ritual rather than a task. I offered to help, but she waved me off with a half-smile and a promise that it was already under control. So I wandered. Not out of boredom, but curiosity. I'd been in her home plenty of times now, but I'd never really looked. The living room. Shelves held books of all kinds. Poetry, gardening. Old philosophy texts, sand tucked between them, were little trinkets from places I suspected she'd once visited. A small ceramic elephant from India, a pressed flower sealed behind glass. A photograph of a mountain range I couldn't name. Everything felt placed with intention, yet none of it screamed for attention. It was a reflection of Hurliard, quiet and endlessly intriguing. The soup was simple, but comforting. And we ate in comfortable silence while the windows fogged, and the wind brushed against the house, like an old friend trying to get in. At one point, she reached across the table and touched my wrist. Just briefly, her fingers cold from the ceramic bowl. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic in the movie sense. But it was real. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. After dinner, she pulled out a deck of old cards and challenged me to a game she claimed she used to beat her father at when she was a teenager. I lost. Twice. And she laughed. Not cruelly, but with the kind of joy that felt rooted in something deeper than just winning. We talked about our childhoods, then hers, spent running through fields in upstate New York, mine divided between city, streets, and summer cabins. I told her things I hadn't shared with anyone in years, not because they were secrets, but because I hadn't felt like anyone had really been listening. But she did. She always did. As the night deepened and the storm began to retreat, we sat on the couch beneath the knitted blanket she kept folded over the armrest. Her head rested on my chest, and my arm wrapped easily around her shoulders. Neither of us said it, but we both knew it. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a passing comfort or a fleeting curiosity. This was something taking root. Slowly. Steadily and irrevocably. There were no grand pronouncements. No declarations. Just the steady breath of two people who had found a rhythm, a place, a peace in each other's presence. The rain eased, the candle flickered, and in that simple, quiet moment, I knew he had already chosen her, not despite her being 53. But maybe, just maybe, because of it, the following morning arrived, not with the drama of the previous night's storm, but with a hush. The kind that makes you instinctively move slower, speak softer, and notice more. The world outside Elaine's home was washed clean. The grass darkened and glossy from rain, the air smelling of damp bark and fresh earth. I hadn't planned to stay the night, but somewhere between the soup, the laughter, and the soft rhythm of her breathing against my chest, it no longer felt like a decision. It had simply happened, the way rivers bend toward the sea without needing permission. I woke up before she did, tucked under that thick knitted blanket that had by now become familiar, a part of the quiet intimacy we shared. She lay beside me. Her hair tousled, lips gently parted, a crease across her cheek from where it had pressed into the pillow. For a while I didn't move. I simply watched her breathe, that steady rise and fall that echoed a piece I'd forgotten could exist in the early hours of a day. When I finally stirred, I made my way to the kitchen barefoot, careful not to creak the floorboards too loudly. The light outside had turned golden. The kind of light that pours through the windows like honey and makes everything feel warmer, safer. I rummaged through her cupboards until I found the tea she always brewed and set about boiling water. The mysticity of it all settled over me like a second skin. There was something sacred about making tea in someone else's kitchen, especially when that someone had once been just a client and now felt like the center of something I hadn't dared to name yet. As the kettle hissed and the scent of herbs filled the air, I glanced around the room again, taking in the familiarity of her world. Everything here bore her touch, from the arrangement of spices to the small framed quotes near the sink. Handwritten and yellowed with time. She appeared. Not long after, wrapped in a soft blue robe, her feet quiet on the tile floor. She didn't speak, just walked up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her cheek against my back for a long moment. I covered her hands with mine and stood still, letting that silence bloom again between us, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything worth saying already lived in that gesture. When she eventually let go, we moved around the kitchen in a kind of gentle, dance-pouring tea. slicing fruit, plating leftovers to people who had learned the steps of each other without ever being taught. Later that morning, we found ourselves back outside, inspecting the fence again. The wood had dried nicely since the rain, the stain still deep and rich against the softened sky. She teased me about a section that wasn't perfectly level playfully, not critically, and I responded by pretending to be offended, which made her laugh the way I loved most, with her eyes first. And then with that warm ripple of amusement that seemed to fill the air around her. I crouched near the base of the post she had pointed out and pretended to examine it with exaggerated seriousness. She stood above me, arms crossed, her face tilted toward the sky as if the morning had gifted her something only she could fully appreciate. And in that moment, I realized something that sent a subtle ripple through me. I wanted to be here not just today, not just tomorrow, but again and again. I didn't just want the mornings and the porch tea and the candlelit dinners when storms rolled in. I wanted the quieter days, the mundane errands, the early evening walks, the shared silence when words failed us. I wanted the life that came in between the big moments, the ones no one writes about but that, over time, make up the soul of a relationship. She must have felt my gaze because she looked down at me with a soft smirk and said something about how I'd better not get any ideas about building her a shed next, or she'd think I was trying to marry into the property. I laughed, but the truth of her words hit somewhere deeper than she intended. The idea of staying wasn't scary anymore, not like inevitability, not the kind born of desperation or dependence, but of genuine desire. I didn't want to fix things and leave anymore. I wanted to build something that didn't need fixing. I wanted to build with her. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. I spent time tending to her garden, pulling weeds, and staking the sagging. Tomato vines, pausing occasionally to drink water and share glances that said more than our words. When a neighbor strolled by and saw us, she waved with a familiarity I hadn't earned yet. But Elaine waved back, her fingers brushing mine as she did. That touch wasn't accidental. It was subtle, deliberate, and reassuring, as if to say, yes, he belongs here now, later. As the sun sank behind the tree line and the shadows grew longer, we sat again on the porch, the tea replaced by wine, the light replaced by the dim hum of crickets. She told me about her daughter, grown now, living across the country, married with children. She didn't talk about her often, and I didn't push. But tonight, she told me stories that felt sacred, like pieces of herself she'd packed away, until she knew someone would handle them with care. I listened, not because I had to, but because I wanted to know every part of her life that had shaped the woman who now sat beside me. Silhouetted against the last light of day, she looked at me then, her expression serious but open, and said she didn't expect any of this. That it scared her sometimes, how quickly comfort had crept in. That she'd built her world to be self-contained, manageable, and quietly fulfilling. And then I had arrived. Not with noise or disruption, but with presence, with calm, with steadiness. And suddenly her days felt wider, fuller. That scared her more than she liked to admit, she said. I told her I understood, because I did. We were both survivors of something: grief, loneliness, failed beginnings. We had both learned to live without reaching too far. And now, here we were, learning again how to reach slowly, carefully, and with open hands. When I left that night, I didn't feel like I was leaving. Felt like I was stepping away from something that would still be there when I returned. And as I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back and saw her silhouette framed in the porch light, standing just inside the doorway, watching until I turned the corner and disappeared from view. It wasn't goodbye. It wasn't even a question. It was a promise, and I intended to keep it. The next week unfolded with an unusual calmness, like life itself had chosen to breathe slower around us. Each day felt like a page from a quiet, handwritten journal, softly worn, quietly intentional, and rich in small but meaningful details. I returned to Elaine's house the following morning, not because I had a scheduled repair or some excuse to justify my visit, but because not going felt wrong, like skipping a step in a familiar ritual that had become the center of my days. The sun was higher by the time I arrived, casting long golden slats across her porch. the wooden boards warm and familiar beneath my boots. She was already in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back loosely, humming to herself, as though the world hadn't changed in decades. And yet it had, because I was there. She welcomed me in without hesitation. That morning, instead of fixing anything, we simply worked side by side. The fence stood, solid and finished. Almost symbolic, now a line we had crossed together, and then blurred with the comfort of shared time. I helped her trim some hedges while she harvested basil and tomatoes with the kind of quiet joy reserved for people who understand the beauty of growing things. We didn't talk much about anything grand. We spoke about the stubborn neighborhood, squirrels, about how the tomatoes were ripening late this year, and about the local fair that had returned after a long hiatus. There was a rhythm to our words, a shared cadence that mirrored our footsteps on the garden path. Her presence beside me didn't demand attention, it offered steadiness. The kind of grounding you only find when you finally stopped searching. At one point, she handed me a glass of cold lemonade, and we sat on the back steps, shaded by the wide limbs of her old maple tree. I noticed the way the sunlight played across her skin, the way her fingers curled slightly around the glass, as if remembering the feel of something more than just chilled condensation. I realized then that there were so many details about her. I hadn't known I had memorized how she tilted her head when she was listening closely, how she always sat slightly off-center on a step, as if saving space for someone, how she looked. At her own home, with the kind of affection usually reserved for people, these weren't just observations, they were anchors. Pieces of a growing map I didn't even realize I had begun to draw. The quietness between us that day wasn't avoidance or awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that blooms only between two people who have nothing to prove to each other anymore. We were just there to separate lives, slowly weaving together in ways neither of us had expected, but both had stopped resisting. When the breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of blooming lavender and freshly cut grass, she turned to me with a small, tired smile and said it felt good not to be alone. I didn't respond with words, only with a nod, and that was enough. In the afternoon, we took a walk through the neighborhood. She showed me a trail near the edge of the park she used to walk with her dog before he passed away. There was a bench there, half hidden beneath a canopy of trees, weathered by time and softened by moss. She said she used to sit there when she needed to think, sometimes for hours. We sat there together for a long time, not thinking, not needing to. Just letting the rustle of the leaves and the chirping of birds create the soundtrack to a shared pause in a fast-moving world. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but it was real. As the day waned, we returned to her house. And I made dinner for once, a simple pasta dish with whatever vegetables we had picked from her garden earlier. She watched me from across the kitchen, occasionally stepping in to stir a pot or sprinkle herbs, but mostly just smiling quietly. Like seeing someone else use her space this way was a new, intimate kind of joy. The kitchen filled with warmth, not just from the stove or the candles she lit after the sun dipped low, but from something more subtle, something deeper. It felt like home, and not just because of the food. After we finished eating, we sat in the living room, her head leaning softly against my shoulder, the fire from the small hearth crackling gently. She showed me old family photo albums, flipping through pages of birthdays, holidays, quiet in-between moments captured in the faded gloss of prints. She pointed out her daughter as a child, a toothy grin under a floppy sun hat, her ex-husband. In the background of a barbecue, unposed and looking slightly unsure of himself. She didn't speak with bitterness or regret, just acceptance. Her life had been full of chapters, some joyful, some painful, and she had survived them all with grace and the kind of strength that doesn't shout. I didn't try to fill the space with questions. I let her tell the stories she wanted to tell, and I listened like they were being spoken only once, like each word mattered more than the last. That night, as I prepared to leave, she walked me to the door and stood beside me for a long while without saying anything. The porch light cast a halo around her hair, and for a brief second, I saw her as I imagined she must have looked decades ago, full of dreams, unaware of the disappointments that would eventually follow. But then she turned toward me, and the expression she wore was not of someone clinging to her past, but of someone ready, at last, to build something new. She reached for my hand, and I took it. There was no dramatic kiss, no confessional outpouring, just the quiet, unmistakable feeling of two people standing in the same moment, choosing each other with a look and a touch. And when I left that evening, I didn't look back like I had before. I didn't need to, because for the first time, I knew without question that I was not leaving something behind. I was walking towards something that had already begun to grow, sturdy and quiet. Like roots beneath the soil, we had both been tending all along. There's a quiet ache that settles in your chest when you begin to realize how much a person has come to matter to you, not because of what they've done or said, but because of how effortlessly they've taken up residence in your daily thoughts. In the days that followed that slow-burning evening on Elaine's porch, I found myself thinking of her not with longing or urgency, but with a kind of rooted calm. She didn't dominate my mind like a storm, but instead lingered like a melody I didn't want to stop humming. Everything around me, routine jobs, errands, even the sound of the morning radio seemed softer, more distant. The only thing that felt sharp was the clarity I now had about what she meant to me. I'd always been a man who moved from one place to the next, one job to the next, not because I was restless, but because I hadn't yet found a reason to stop moving. It had changed. Somewhere between repairing a fence and preparing soup in a warmly lit kitchen, it's between quiet mornings in her garden and the press of her hand against mine as we stood beneath the porch light, something in me had begun to settle. I didn't need to run anymore. I didn't need to pretend that I was just a passerby in her life. I wanted roots. I wanted laughter that didn't need punchlines and silences that didn't need filling. I wanted Elaine. That week I found myself returning not just for her, but for us. There was no longer a need for repairs or projects. The fence stood as sturdy as ever. But each day brought with it something new: breakfasts on the back steps, sorting through old vinyl records, spontaneous drives through back roads lined with orange and gold trees. One afternoon we stopped at a roadside fruit stand and bought too many apples, laughing about the way we both instinctively reached for the same ones. Back at her house, she insisted on baking a pie from scratch, even though she claimed she hadn't done it in years. I watched her hands work the dough, flour streaking her cheeks. Yes. And I remember thinking how I'd never seen anyone look more at home in their own skin. While the pie baked, we sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and listening to the rain that had begun to whisper against the windows. The smell of cinnamon and butter filled the house, and everything felt like a scene from a life I'd never thought I'd live: quiet, stable, deeply good. At one point she turned toward me, eyes tracing mine, and asked what I was thinking. I didn't give a grand answer. I simply said this. And she nodded because she understood. She was thinking the same thing. It was around that time that she began to talk more about her past, not in heavy, dramatic confessions, but in soft recollections that revealed the shape of her journey. She spoke of her first marriage, of the years she spent trying to be everything for someone who never really saw her. She told me about how she had lost herself slowly in pieces, until one day she realized she had nothing left to give. She didn't cry when she spoke. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a deep earned wisdom. I listened, not to respond, but to witness. I held her hand, not because she needed comfort, but because I wanted her to know I was there fully. Without hesitation, the next morning, I showed up with nothing in my hands but a smile. She opened the door before I knocked, like she'd been waiting. That day, we didn't do anything particularly special. We raked leaves, we cleaned out her attic. We discovered a dusty old box of letters she had written to her younger self, but never mailed. The kind of raw, vulnerable truths only meant for the person who had lived them. She read one aloud, her voice quiet but steady, and when she was finished, I reached over and kissed the back of her hand, letting the silence wrap around us like a warm coat. Later that evening, as we stood side by side washing dishes, she asked what I thought about growing old in a house like hers, one with a garden, a squeaky screen door, a swing under a tree. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, the way the light played along the curve of her jaw, the way her hair curled slightly at the edges from the steam rising off the sink. I think it sounds perfect, I said eventually. And she smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just a soft, knowing curve that said she felt the same. In that moment, I knew something had shifted for good. We weren't just falling into each other. Anymore, we were choosing it. Actively, daily, gently. There were no fireworks, no sweeping romantic gestures. Just the quiet, sacred act of two people building something lasting out of ordinary days. I didn't need to hear her say she loved me. I saw it in the way she folded the corner of the page in the book she wanted to read to me. I felt it in the way her hand brushed against mine when she passed me the coffee mug. I heard it in the way she said my name when I wasn't doing anything special. And as I stood on her porch again that night, just before I turned to leave, she reached out, held my face in both her hands, and simply said, "You came when I thought no one ever would." I closed my eyes, leaned into her touch, and knew without a doubt that she had been waiting, not just for someone, but for me. The days that followed felt like pages being written in a book. Neither of us had realized we were co-authoring each. Mornings started with something small, sometimes a steaming cup of coffee, already waiting for me on her porch. Sometimes a text with just a simple, "Today looks like a pie day," or "Come help me find the rake again." But those little things began to string themselves together into something larger, something steady. Her home had stopped feeling like just her space, and it started to feel like ours, even if we hadn't spoken those words out loud. The tools I once kept in the back of my truck now had a small spot in her shed. My spare jacket hung on a hook inside her entryway, and she didn't move it. The fence I'd repaired stood tall, a symbol not just of a job completed, but of something built intentionally, with care, and meant to last. Elaine began to open herself more in those days, not dramatically or in some sudden flood of vulnerability, but with a natural unfolding, like a flower responding to steady light. She told me about the years after her divorce, how she had spent them slowly reclaiming herself, bit by bit. How she had learned to paint not for others, but for her own soul. How she began volunteering at the community center just to remind herself that she still mattered to someone. She spoke about loneliness, but never in a way that asked for pity. Instead, she described it with the kind of strength only someone who has endured it and survived it can possess. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't fall away. She was telling me her story because she wanted me to be part of the next chapter. That Saturday, we drove out to the edge of town to visit an orchard she loved. She said it had been years since she'd gone, but as soon as we stepped onto the gravel path leading to rows of trees heavy with fruit, it was as if no time had passed at all. The place welcomed her like an old friend. Children ran past us, laughing and dragging bags half their size. And older couples strolled arm in arm, picking slowly, methodically. We took our time, wandering between trees, brushing our shoulders. Now and then, stealing glances when we thought the other wasn't looking. At one point, she reached up for a particularly round apple and nearly lost her balance. I caught her by the waist without thinking. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from that strange, undeniable intimacy of being touched with care. For a long moment, we didn't move, and then she smiled. That small, sincere smile that had started to feel like home to me. We carried the apples in a shared basket and talked about nothing in particular, what colors we loved most in autumn, the names we'd give to pets we didn't have yet, whether we'd ever retire near the coast, just to listen to the ocean. She told me she used to dream about opening a bookstore cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and soft jazz playing in the background. I told her I'd come in every morning, just to sit in the corner and watch her run the place. When we got back to her house, she insisted on baking again, this time a crisp. I offered to help, but she was in her zone, slicing apples and mixing spices like she was following muscle memory more than a recipe. I sat at the counter, sipping tea, watching her move, marveling again at how quietly powerful she was. She wasn't trying to impress me. She never had. Everything she did with intention. And being near her made me want to be better, slower, more deliberate in the way I moved through the world. After the crisp was in the oven, she sat beside me, her hands dusted with flour, and we just sat there, side by side, listening to the quiet hum of the kitchen. The ticking of the old wall clock, the distant rustle of wind through the trees outside. The air was full of cinnamon and something I couldn't name, something warm and old and sacred. That evening, after dessert and dishes and a little too much wine, we ended up back on the couch beneath the same blanket we had shared a few nights before. Her head found my shoulder, and my arm wrapped around her like it had been waiting to belong there all along. She spoke softly about a recurring dream she used to have when she was younger, of walking through a field at dusk, alone, searching for something she never found. But lately, she said, the dream had changed. Now she wasn't searching. Now she was just walking, but someone was beside her. She didn't say who, and I didn't ask. I didn't need to. I knew that night, as I helped her close up the house, turning off lights, locking doors, making sure the fire was safe. I noticed the way she looked at me, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had returned, someone who had stayed. She didn't say thank you, and I didn't need her to. Her eyes said everything. And as I stood at the doorway, my hand on the knob, she stepped in close and rested her forehead against my chest for just a moment. It was small, gentle, quiet. But it was enough. And when I stepped outside, the air crisp and cool around me, I knew something had changed. I wasn't going home. I already was home. It just happened to be in a place with an old wooden fence, a cinnamon-scented kitchen, and a woman who had, without meaning to, made me believe in a kind of love I'd long forgotten was possible. The rhythm we found in each other didn't feel like something newly composed, but rather like a forgotten song remembered by heart. The days passed not in sweeping arcs of drama, but in the kind of peaceful repetition that somehow made every moment feel richer. Mornings started early now, not because I had to be somewhere, but because I wanted to wake up in the gentle quiet before Elaine Street came alive. I'd arrive with breakfast sometimes from a diner we both liked, sometimes homemade if I'd had time to prepare, and she would greet me in that soft robe of hers, with sleep still clinging to her eyelashes, and a smile that made my chest ache in the best way. There was no performance between us anymore. The edges of our lives were softening into each other's. That week we painted the back patio. It didn't need it really, but Elaine had said something about how she always wanted to change the color, and I took that as more than a comment. It was an invitation. So we spent 2 days pulling furniture aside, pressure washing the old coat, and carefully laying down thick, earthy tones that made her backyard feel even more like a place people stayed, not passed through. We played music while we worked, old jazz records mostly, the kind her father used to listen to. And in the evenings, when our hands were speckled with paint and our shoulders sore, we'd sit on the porch steps and drink cold beer, her head leaning against mine as we watched the paint dry under the fading sun. It wasn't exciting, wasn't cinematic, but it felt like a promise being kept. Her neighbors had started to take notice. Not in the nosy way, but in the curious, warm sort of way that older communities tend to observe from their porches. One morning, as I was unloading some supplies from my truck, Mr. Jennings, from 2 doors down, stopped his walk to say he hadn't seen Elaine laugh like this in years. He smiled knowingly, gave me a nod that said more than words ever could, and walked on. That same afternoon, a woman named Loretta left a plate of lemon bars on Elaine's doorstep with a handwritten note. "For you and your helper, he's got good eyes." Elaine showed me the note with a wink and a blush, pretending to be embarrassed. But I knew it made her happy. People were beginning to see what we were both still learning to say out loud. It was during one of those late afternoons, while we were touching up the trim near the garden shed, that she told me about her mother. How she had been a fierce woman, with a soft heart, someone who had loved deeply and often, but had always ended up a little heartbroken. Elaine said she feared becoming that giving too much, only to be left emptier than before. But then she paused and looked at me, and I knew the rest of what she meant, even before she said it. I wasn't like the others. I wasn't someone passing through. She wasn't afraid with me, not in the way she used to be. We didn't linger on the moment. We didn't need to. Some truths are best left to settle in the silence they create. One evening, as autumn began brushing the leaves with its first hints of gold and copper, she surprised me with tickets to a small art exhibit in town, a night off from hammers. "And brushes," she said, grinning as she handed me the envelope. We dressed a little nicer than usual, she in a navy dress that brought out the gray in her eyes, and me in a shirt I hadn't worn since my sister's wedding. The gallery was tucked between a bookstore and a florist. its walls lined with works from local painters, some pieces loud and chaotic, others quiet and aching. We moved slowly, hand in hand, pausing to linger in front of one canvas in particular. It was a watercolor soft, almost blurred of two people sitting on a bench, backs to the viewer, hands just barely touching. I looked over at Elaine and she was already smiling at me. "That one feels like us," she whispered. Afterward, we walked down the cobbled streets and found a tiny cafe still open, its windows glowing amber, its tables mostly empty. We sat outside beneath a heater, sharing a single slice of cake and sipping espresso we both admitted was too bitter. The night air was crisp, but her presence made it warm. We didn't talk much about the past or the future. We talked about the here and now, the flavor of the icing, the way the waitress wore her hair, the tune playing softly through the speakers overhead. And when we walked back to the truck, her arm looped through mine, she looked up at the stars and said she couldn't remember the last time she felt so much like herself. That night, I didn't leave. We didn't plan it. I just followed her inside and we moved through the evening like we'd done it 1,000 times. She left the porch, light on, not for me to find my way out, but because she wanted me to stay. And when we fell asleep, it was with her fingers curled against my chest and the rhythm of her breath matching mine. Like we had both finally found the rhythm of something we didn't know we were missing. By then, there was no more pretending that I was still just her handyman, or that I'd be leaving when the work was done. The fence had been finished long ago, but what we were building now went beyond wood and nails. It was slow. It was real. And though neither of us had spoken the words aloud yet, they hung in the air between us, tender and obvious, waiting for the moment they'd no longer be necessary. The next morning arrived quietly, with soft sunlight bleeding through her curtains and the faint hum of a distant lawnmower serving as the only sign that the world outside continued to move. I woke before Elaine, lying still for a while, watching her breathe beside me. The way her brow remained smooth, the corners of her lips softly upturned, and one hand loosely curled against her chest, all of it settled something deep in me, something that had never been quite at ease before. Hadn't known what waking up beside someone like this could feel like. Not urgent, not heavy, just peaceful. Her presence was like a slow song that had been playing beneath the noise of my life all along. And now that I'd finally heard it, I couldn't imagine silence again. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and wandered into the kitchen. The morning light illuminated the worn wooden counter, the familiar ceramic mug I always used, and the pair of slippers she kept near the door. These ordinary details felt sacred now, like chapters in a story we were writing, one breath, one cup of coffee, one shared silence at a time. I moved slowly, deliberately, grounding myself in the routine of making breakfast as if performing a quiet ritual of gratitude. The eggs sizzled gently in the pan, the bread warmed in the toaster, and the kettle let out a soft whistle that seemed almost reluctant to disturb the calm. Elaine emerged shortly after, still in her robe, hair tousled, eyes soft from sleep. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped into the room, wrapped her arms around me from behind, and pressed her cheek against my back. That simple gesture held more weight than any spoken vow. We didn't need declarations. We had presence. We had the quiet trust that comes from showing up every single day, even when there's no script to follow. Breakfast was eaten at the small kitchen table, laughter coming easy, the taste of butter and jam sweeter than usual. She asked if I could stay the entire day, and I didn't hesitate before nodding. The day didn't have an agenda, but neither of us needed one anymore. Being near her had become its own purpose. Later, we walked through her backyard, surveying the changes we'd made in the past few weeks. The fence looked strong and weathered now, like it had always been part of the landscape. The garden was alive with color, the leaves beginning to blush with early signs of fall. She pointed out a patch of ground she'd been thinking of turning into a vegetable bed, and I knelt to test the soil without a word, already thinking of the steps we'd take to prepare it. These were not grand gestures, but acts of building a shared life, one small intention at a time. We raked leaves together, her laughing when I tried to catch them mid-air, her eyes shining like they used to when she was a girl, she said. In those moments, I wasn't her handyman, and she wasn't a woman rebuilding after loss. We were simply two people who had found something worth staying for. As the day waned, we found ourselves in the living room, music playing low on the record player. The kind of melody that threads itself between your ribs and makes everything feel slower. She rested her legs over mine as we sat curled up on the couch, flipping through a book of poems she said she used to read in college. Occasionally, she'd read a line aloud, her voice barely louder than the breeze whispering through the slightly open window. I didn't understand every verse, but I understood the way she read them as, if reclaiming parts of herself long tucked away. That night, I carried her to bed when she fell asleep mid-sentence, the book still resting open on her lap. I laid it gently on the nightstand and watched her for a long moment, wondering how I'd ever thought my life was full before she walked into it. The next morning brought something unexpected, a call from a friend offering me a long-term renovation job out of state. It was the kind of work I used to chase. Good money, months of stability, a chance to be part of something big. I listened to the offer in silence, my eyes drifting to the window where Elaine stood in the yard, barefoot in the grass, sipping her tea and watching a bird peck at the feeder. My heart twisted, not from indecision, but from the realization that the man who would have taken that job without blinking no longer existed. I turned it down, gently, firmly, then went outside to stand beside her. She didn't ask what the call was about. She didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us now that didn't require explanation. I had chosen her, not in a dramatic moment or with grand words. I chose her in 100 little ways, and I would keep choosing her every day for as long as she'd let me. We spent that afternoon making stew. She chopped vegetables while I browned the meat. Our movements synchronized like a dance we hadn't learned, but somehow knew. The smell filled the house, rich and comforting, as rain began to tap gently against the windows. We ate by candlelight, the storm outside amplifying the warmth inside. She told me stories about her daughter who lived on the other side of the country, how they'd once spent an entire summer building a treehouse together. Her eyes sparkled as she remembered, but I saw the flicker of sadness, to the ache of time passing. I listened, not to solve or fix, but simply to hold space for her words, to be the place she could set down the weight of memory without fear it would shatter. That night, we danced. No music, no reason. Just the hush of rain and the creak of old floorboards beneath our feet. Her head on my shoulder, her breath steady against my neck, and my hands around her like a question already answered. We didn't speak, didn't need to. The moment held everything. And when we finally fell into bed, limbs tangled, hearts quiet, I knew that no job, no paycheck. No other life I could have had would ever compare to this. The beauty of simply being seen, chosen, held in return. There's something profoundly beautiful about days that pass without needing to be labeled. Not birthdays or anniversaries or holidays, just regular days stitched together by shared glances, unfinished conversations, and the quiet rhythm of coexisting. That was the kind of day we had after the storm. The morning light filtered through the trees with that unmistakable after-rain crispness. Like the whole world had been washed and wrung clean. Elaine stood at the window, sipping her tea, the edges of her hair still sleep mussed and her robe drawn loose. I sat on the couch, watching her, not saying anything because some moments lose their magic when broken by sound. After breakfast, we went outside to survey the yard. The storm had knocked down a few branches, scattered leaves, and left the flower beds soggy but intact. It wasn't damage that needed urgent fixing, just the kind of gentle messiances that gave us something to do together. As we raked and clipped and cleared, I couldn't help but notice how icily we moved in sync. No planning, no need for directions, just an unspoken understanding. When she reached for the compost bin, I was already holding the lid. When I went to collect the pruning shears, she had them ready. It wasn't choreographed, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was us. She paused for a moment beside the fence, the one that had started it all. Her eyes traced the grain of the wood like she was reading a story written there. I stood a few steps behind her, unsure if she was lost in thought or waiting for me to speak. At Then, without turning around, she said something about time, how it moves in strange ways, how some weeks feel like years and some years vanish in days. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I understood. Being with her had altered my sense of time too. It no longer felt like something I was racing against. It felt like something I was finally living inside. That afternoon we drove to the hardware store, not for anything urgent, but because she wanted to build a small bookshelf for the guest room. The ride there was filled with mundane conversation. What kind of wood she liked, whether we should get extra nails if we had enough sandpaper at home. But even those words felt like layers being added to something bigger. At the store, she held up 2 samples of wood, both nearly identical, and asked which I preferred. I pointed to the darker grain, and she smiled. "That's what I was thinking too," she said. But I suspected she would have said that no matter what I chose. Back at the house, we set up in the garage, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. Across the floor, she tied her hair back with a bandana, and I couldn't help but admire the way she made even manual labor look elegant. We measured and cut, drilled and sanded, all while music played softly from her old speaker, the kind of songs that sound like childhood memories even if you've never heard them before. We worked in that slow, intentional way people do when they aren't in a hurry to be anywhere else. Every now and then, she'd brush sawdust off my shirt and I'd tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. These weren't grand gestures. They were the language we'd come to speak. When the bookshelf was finally assembled, slightly crooked but charming in its imperfection, we stood back and admired it like parents of a handmade gift. "It's a little wonky," she said, tilting her head. "Like us," I replied, and she laughed, not the polite kind, but the kind that bubbled up from her chest and made her eyes crinkle. We carried it inside together and placed it near the window in the guest room. She already had a small stack of books waiting navels, with creased spines and handwritten notes in the margins. She began arranging them, humming softly, while I stood in the doorway, watching, memorizing. That evening we sat on the porch again. The air had turned cooler, the first true sign of autumn's approach. She wrapped herself in a blanket and leaned into me, her head against my shoulder, her hand tucked beneath mine. The street was quiet, just the occasional bark of a distant dog or the faint hiss of a sprinkler turning off. It felt like the world had slowed down to meet our pace. We didn't talk much, just watched the sky shift colors and the stars emerge one by one. I realized then that I hadn't checked my phone in hours, hadn't thought once about what day it was or what emails might be waiting. All that mattered was here, wrapped in a shared silence beneath a softening sky. Before bed, we played a game. She used to play with her daughter, naming 5 things from the day that brought joy. I went first: the crooked bookshelf, the way she hummed while sorting books, the warmth of her laugh in the garage, the quiet porch, and the way she looked in the golden hour light. She teased me for being too sentimental, then listed hers. How? I carried the heavier end of the wood without complaining. The moment our hands touched, reaching for the same screwdriver, the smell of fresh sawdust, how I didn't flinch when she messed up a measurement, and the way I looked at her like she mattered. That night, I fell asleep a little closer, a little quieter, our breaths sinking once again. And somewhere between the softness of the sheets and the softness of her heart, I understood that love didn't need fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it was just 2 people building a slightly crooked bookshelf together, and loving it all the more because they'd done it with care. The days that followed carried with them an ease that I hadn't known in years, a kind of comfort that grows not from loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but from a quiet repetition of shared moments. Elaine and I had begun settling into a rhythm, not unlike the ones couples build over years, those small, predictable rituals that seem meaningless from the outside but serve as the scaffolding of a life built together. Each morning, I would arrive earlier than needed. Without having to ask, she'd have brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sliced fruit for us both. There was something beautiful about how natural it had become, not performative, not done to impress. Just 2 people learning how to exist beside each other with grace. One morning, the air had shifted. You could smell the crispness of early autumn creeping into the wind, and a thin veil of mist hung over the lawn. I found her sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in a shawl, her hands cupped around a warm mug. She looked out across her yard, her gaze focused on nothing in particular, yet completely absorbed. I sat down beside her, the wooden swing creaking gently under our weight, and we rocked in silence for a long while. The neighborhood was still. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, as if the whole world understood that this moment, however, small, was not to be disturbed. We didn't speak, not out of avoidance, but because the silence between us had become a space of comfort rather than emptiness. It was in that space, between shared glances and the brushing of arms, that I began to realize we had stepped out of the shallow waters of companionship and into something deeper, something unspoken but solid. That afternoon, we decided to reorganize. Her garage. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't something she had to do, but she claimed it had been bugging her for years. I knew it was more about us spending time together than anything else, and I welcomed the task. The garage was cluttered, with boxes, some labeled, others anonymous. There were old holiday decorations, half-finished DIY projects, and a few framed photographs wrapped in newspaper and tucked into corners like forgotten secrets. As we sorted through them, she laughed at her own hoarding tendencies, and I teased her gently about the 5 identical glue guns she apparently owned. But then we found an old box marked mementos in black marker, and something in her shifted. She pulled it close and opened it slowly, her fingers brushing against time-worn letters. Faded photographs and delicate trinkets that once held meaning. She showed me a photo of her younger self, no older than 20, standing barefoot on a beach. Wind in her hair and eyes full of something wild. She said she hadn't felt like that girl in a long time, but looking at me, she could almost remember who she used to be. Later, as we continued to clear the space, we found an old record player tucked behind a stack of boxes. It was dusty, needle-worn, but she insisted on trying it anyway. We set it up on a cleared workbench, found a few records in a sleeve nearby, and let the crackling music fill the air. It was a melody she hadn't heard in decades, but she remembered every word. Without asking, she reached for my hand and guided me to the open space in the center of the garage. There, among cobwebs and dust motes, illuminated by slants of afternoon light, we danced. Slow, awkward, clumsy at first, but then, like everything else between us, it settled into rhythm. Her head on my chest, my hand at the small of her back, the music swaying around us as if it had been waiting all these years just for this moment. There was no reason for it, no audience, no performance. It's just her and me, and a song older than both of us, playing for hearts that had finally found home. That evening, we shared a quiet dinner on the back patio. A few candles flickered against the dark, casting golden light over her face. We talked about places we'd never been but wanted to visit. She mentioned a small coastal town she once saw in a travel magazine, a place with narrow streets and vibrant flowers in every window box. I promised her that someday we'd go there, not as tourists, but as people looking for stories in the quiet places. And when I said it, I meant it with a certainty I rarely felt, because with her, the future no longer felt like a distant mirage, felt like something we were actively shaping together. As the stars emerged, one by one above us, she leaned over and placed her hand over mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly deliberate. But in that touch, there was a knowing, a quiet kind of acknowledgement that we were no longer dancing around something unspoken. We were stepping into it fully. There was no need to rush it or define it or wrap it in declarations. The truth was in the way our days now began and ended with each other. The truth was in the way she no longer waited for me to knock before opening the door. It was in the way I had started, leaving a toothbrush in her bathroom and a flannel shirt on her coat hook without even realizing it. It was in the moments we didn't fill with words, because the presence of each other was enough. That night, as I lay beside her, the window cracked open just enough to let the night air in, I realized that I had stopped measuring time in days, or weeks. I was measuring it in heartbeats now, in the cadence of her breath against my neck, the moments of quiet joy that didn't need to be captured or shared or turned into something larger. They were already everything. I loved her not in the fireworks Andros's kind of way, but in the way roots grow into soil steady. It's unseen, but impossible to remove without tearing everything apart. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, the creaking of the old house, and the warmth of her beside me, I knew I didn't need to say it yet. She already knew. There was something about the way autumn settled over Elaine's neighborhood that made the days feel slower, more deliberate. The leaves had begun to turn with conviction now, painting the sidewalks in rust and gold. And the sunlight carried a certain softness, less about brightness and more about warmth. The chill in the air was no longer just a passing breeze. Lingered in the mornings and made its presence known in the evenings, which meant Elaine had begun pulling out her collection of old sweaters and flannel throws. It was during one of those crisp mornings, as we stood on the back porch sipping coffee and watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the fence, I had once come to repair. She told me she had a letter she had never sent. I didn't press her about it, didn't ask what it was or who it was for. But something about the way she said it quietly, like it had been living inside her for too long, stuck with me all day. Later that afternoon, she disappeared into her study while I sanded the front gate. It wasn't in bad shape, but we'd agreed to refinish it before the frost came, sealing out the moisture that might otherwise rot the bottom slats. I worked slowly, deliberately, letting the rhythm of it clear my thoughts. Occasionally I'd glance toward the house and see her silhouette moving behind the window, sometimes pacing, sometimes still. There was a story unfolding in that room that I wasn't a part of yet, and I respected that. We had grown into a kind of love that allowed space for solitude, that didn't need to fill every silence with closeness. When she finally came out, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. She handed me a folded envelope without saying anything and returned inside, leaving me standing there with the weight of something fragile in my hand. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I carried it with me into the garage and set it gently on the workbench, beside a pile of wood we were planning to repurpose for a planter box. It sat there for hours as I busied myself with small tasks, sweeping sorting tools even, checking the hinges on the garage door just to have something to focus on. Eventually, when the sky had turned a deep indigo and the first stars had started to emerge, I sat down on the bench, the envelope in my hands, and read what she had written. The handwriting was delicate but sure, the ink faded just slightly. At the edges, and as my eyes moved across the page, a version of Elaine emerged that I hadn't yet met. This was the woman she had been before me, one who had loved and lost, who had carried grief like a second skin, and tried to make sense of a life that had not unfolded the way she once imagined. She spoke of fears of growing old, alone, of giving too much of herself to people who only stayed for the parts that were easy, of waking up one day and realizing that the best chapters of her life had already been written. But she also wrote of hope, quiet hope, the kind that arrives not like a thunderclap, but like morning dew, subtle, soft, undeniable. And at the end of the letter, she mentioned me. It's not by name, but in the way she described how unexpected joy had returned to her, how laughter had started to feel like something natural again, how the simple presence of someone steady had begun to change the rhythm of her days. When I looked up from the letter, I realized she had been standing in the doorway, arms crossed, gently over her chest, watching me. We didn't speak, didn't need to, stood, walked to her and wrapped my arms around her, holding her as if the letter had been a bridge and we were meeting in the middle of it. There was a kind of silence between us that only comes after being truly seen. It was as if she had laid herself bare on those pages, and in doing so, invited me to meet not just the woman she had become, but all the versions she had once been. That night, we didn't fall asleep right away. Instead, we lay facing each other in bed, the letter folded neatly on the nightstand, her fingers tracing lazy lines along my arm. There was no tension, no urgency, just the steady hum of two people learning how to rest in each other the next day. We returned to our routines, but everything felt subtly different, like the light in a room you've entered 1,000 times. But now, see from a new angle. We took a walk down the long path behind her house, the one that curved gently toward the edge of the woods. It had always been a favorite of hers, but we'd never gone there together. The leaves crunched beneath our boots, and the air smelled like pine and wood smoke. She told me stories as we walked about childhood bike rides and sneaking out late at night to meet friends under the old oak tree at the edge of town. I listened, storing every word like treasure, knowing that these were the kinds of things you only share when you've decided someone belongs in your history as much as your present. When we reached the clearing, she stopped and looked out across the open space. There was a fallen log, worn smooth by time and weather, and we sat there for a while, saying nothing. Birds rustled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. She turned to me, eyes soft and steady, and said she hadn't realized how much of her life she had spent waiting to feel chosen, waiting to feel safe, waiting to feel like she was enough exactly as she was, no younger, no different, no less. And then so quietly I almost didn't catch it, she said she wasn't waiting anymore. Not since I came into her life. I didn't know what to say, not because I didn't feel the same, but because no words would have been big enough. Simply took her hand and held it tightly, as if anchoring both of us to that moment. When we got back to the house, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a warm halo over the doorway. She turned to me with that familiar smile, the one that always looked like it had taken root somewhere deep inside her. She whispered something I'd never forget. This, whatever this is, it's the first time in a long while I don't feel afraid of the future. And just like that, the weight of years of wounds and waiting seemed to lift from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something almost like peace. The morning after our walk through the woods began quietly, but with a different kind of energy beneath its stillness. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't speak of emptiness, but of something fuller, like the hush before a curtain rises, or the stillness that comes when you finally stop running from your own heart. Elaine moved through the kitchen, humming softly, her hands busy making breakfast as light streamed through the windows and turned the floor into gold. I sat at the table, sipping coffee and watching her, not just because I liked the view, but because something in me still couldn't believe that this had become my life. The woman who had once been just a client, someone who had called me for help with a broken fence, had slowly and without fanfare become the axis my days spun around. Her presence in my life was no longer a surprise, it was a certainty, a rhythm I didn't know I needed until I found it. After breakfast, she brought out a box from the hall closet filled with old photo albums. Not just hers, but one she had inherited from her parents' albums, filled with black and white snapshots of people in stiff collars and dresses, caught mid-laugh or staring seriously into the lens, as if the weight of being remembered hung heavy. On their shoulders, we sat together on the living room floor, legs crossed, albums spread around us like a tapestry of memory. She pointed out faces I'd never seen, told stories of summers spent by the lake, of teenage rebellion and quiet victories. Some stories made her laugh until she wiped her eyes, others made her voice grow quiet, her fingertips lingering on the edges of photos that time had softened. I didn't interrupt, didn't try to rush her through it. Instead, I listened, aware that what she was really sharing wasn't just her history, it was trust. Piece by piece, she was letting me into the parts of herself that had been closed off for too long. There was one photo in particular that held her gaze longer than the rest. It was a candid shot of her in her early 20s, sitting on the hood of an old car with a book in her lap, the sun turning her hair into flames. I could see it then, the trace of that girl still living in the woman beside me. Not lost, not gone, just quieter. She handed me the photo and smiled, but there was a fragility behind it, like she was offering something delicate. I didn't say anything sentimental. I didn't need to. I just placed the photo back gently and reached for her hand, grounding us both in the present, in the version of ourselves that had fought through decades to arrive here. Later that afternoon, we walked into town. There was a small farmer's market by the library, and Elaine wanted to pick up fresh apples and maybe some late-season squash. We strolled slowly, her arm tucked into mine, passing by neighbors and strangers who greeted her with familiarity. It was clear she had lived here long enough to become a fixture, the kind of person people waved to without needing a reason. of them gave us curious glances, not judgmental, just inquisitive, like they were trying to adjust their mental image of her to include me. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned in closer, her fingers tightening, slightly on my arm, as if to say, "Let them look. This is real." We bought more than we needed, as always happens at markets: fresh bread, homemade jam, a pie from a vendor who swore it was the best in the county. We carried our bags back to the car, laughing about our lack of self-control, and by the time we got home, the sun was beginning its slow descent. She suggested we make soup and settle in for a quiet evening, and I gladly agreed. There was something sacred about those evenings when the outside world faded and it was just the two of us, cooking together, brushing past one another in the kitchen, stealing tastes from spoons and exchanging glances that said more than words. Ever could, the soup simmered on the stove while we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the scent of rosemary and garlic drifting out behind us. The sky burned with oranges and purples, and as we watched the day fold itself into night, Elaine spoke in a voice just above a whisper. She told me that this house, this season, its feeling was the first time in years she hadn't felt like a supporting character in her own life. That being with me had reminded her that joy didn't have to be loud, and that sometimes the softest love was the most lasting. She said she hadn't expected me to stay, that she'd prepared herself for a temporary warmth, a passing affection. But what she felt now terrified her in the best way. It felt permanent. It felt like home. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't feel the same, but because I wanted to be sure she knew I understood the gravity of what she was saying. I looked at her. Leela looked tanned, saw a woman who had weathered storms and still stood tall, who had learned to, carried her own weight, but was now finally letting someone else shoulder it with her. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid of permanence either. In fact, I craved it. I wanted the repetition of our mornings, the softness of our evenings, the masinzas of our middle-of-the-night conversations. I wanted it all. Hard days and the beautiful ones. And I knew, without question, that I would choose her. Not despite her age or her past or the things she thought made her complicated, but because of them. That night, after we'd cleaned up and changed into pajamas, she found me in the living room, holding the photo of her on the car again. Sat beside me, tucked her legs beneath her, and leaned into my side. No words passed between us. They didn't need to. Everything that needed saying had already been said in glances, in touch, in the silences we'd learned to treasure. I kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer, and we stayed that way until sleep crept in around the corners of the room, wrapping us in the kind of peace neither of us had dared to hope for when we first met. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains in quiet beams, spilling across the hardwood floor like golden silk. It was the kind of soft, forgiving light that made everything appear gentler, the edges of furniture, the creases in skin, the stillness of a sleeping body next to you. Elaine stirred beside me, not fully awake but aware, her hand finding mine. Under the blankets and curling into it, without a word, we didn't speak right away, letting the silence stretch into something sacred. I had never been one to linger in bed, always rising early, starting the day with movement, with purpose. But something about her presence made me want to pause and exist in this in-between place where the world hadn't fully started yet. There was peace in the way our breathing aligned, in the warmth of her against me, in the knowledge that this was now part of the fabric of my life, not just a passing chapter, but an entire volume I hadn't known. We eventually rose and moved through the morning with a kind of unspoken synchronicity that only comes when two people begin to know the contours of each other's routines. I prepared the coffee, while she sliced fresh fruit, and we ate on the back porch wrapped in sweaters, the air crisp and filled with the scent of earth and drying leaves. A dog barked somewhere down the street. The distant rumble of a garbage truck echoed off the pavement. The world turned as it always had, but for me, everything felt subtly altered, as though a new lens had been placed over reality, one that made even the mundane feel rich with meaning. Elaine mentioned she had errands to run in town, a haircut, a stop by the florist to pick up a delivery, maybe a browse through the antique store she loved. I offered to join her, and she smiled with a warmth that told me she'd been hoping I would. We drove, with the windows cracked open just enough to let in the breeze. The town was modest, but it had charm. Brick sidewalks, lamp posts draped in, early autumn garlands, shop windows filled with displays of spiced candles, knit scarves, and books with worn covers. People nodded in greeting as we passed, some recognizing Elaine and offering brief pleasantries. Others offered curious glances, lingering a second too long before continuing on. I was aware of them, but not bothered. This town had known her. As one thing for years independent, reserved, the woman who lived in the White House at the end of the cul-de-sac. Seeing her with someone must have rewritten their assumptions, but it didn't shake her. She moved through the spaces with quiet confidence, brushing against me now and then, leaning in to show me something she found beautiful or strange. It was like watching her bloom in real time. At the florist's, she picked up a bouquet of soft, pink peonies and dusty eucalyptus, explaining they were for her sister's birthday. She told me stories about their childhood while we waited at the counter, tales of rivalry and loyalty, of laughter and grief, of a bond that had been tested but never broken. As she spoke, I saw the layers of her life unfold again, more colors, more depth, more reasons to admire the woman I was coming to love with increasing certainty. Her stories didn't always have happy endings. Some were marked by absence, by longing, by years that passed too quickly or not quickly enough. But they were real. And in their honesty, I found myself drawn to her even more. We stopped for lunch at a small cafe that served soup and mismatched ceramic bowls and sandwiches wrapped in parchment. We sat by the window, the street just beyond, and she reached across the table to adjust the collar of my coat with that familiar blend of affection and casual intimacy that made my chest tighten. These small gestures, so easy to overlook, had begun to mean everything. We spoke about plans for the coming week, about finishing the repairs on the garden fence before the next rain, about trying a new recipe she'd found online. Ordinary topics, but within them was the pulse of something profound, a shared life, quietly assembling itself out of the ordinary as we made our way back home. The skies began to darken with the promise of an early evening storm. We beat the first drops by minutes, laughing as we ducked into the house with our bags. The rain came quickly after, tapping at the windows in soft percussion, a soundtrack to the rest of our afternoon. She lit candles and turned on an old jazz. Record the crackle and hum of vinyl warming the room. I helped her arrange the flowers in a tall glass vase and watched. As she moved through the space like someone finally at ease, she caught me looking and raised an eyebrow in mock suspicion, and I told her I was just memorizing the moment. She shook her head, but the blush that rose to her cheeks said she didn't mind the attention. That evening, we sat by the fireplace. The room dim, except for the flickering glow of the flames. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm outside, the kind of rain that makes you grateful to be indoors, wrapped in someone else's presence. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I traced idle patterns on her forearm, thinking about how far we'd come in such a short time, not just in days or distance, but in trust, in vulnerability, in the decision to let each other in. I thought about the first time I'd seen her guard, elegant, sharp in her observations but distant in her demeanor, and I thought about the woman beside me, now soft in, open, willing to be seen in all her complexity. We didn't talk about the future in concrete terms. There were no grand plans, no timelines or ultimatums. But there was an understanding, one that lived in the spaces between our glances. In the easy way, we moved through the house together, in the comfort of shared silence. It was the kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken to be known. It just existed, like gravity, pulling us toward each other whether we acknowledged it or not. As the fire burned low and the rain continued its quiet song, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper, and told me she hadn't felt this safe in a very long time. I kissed her forehead and held her closer, letting her know that neither had I, and in that moment, I realized that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly on ordinary days, with someone who just shows up and stays. The rain continued through the night, steady, soft drum beat against the roof that lulled us both into a deeper kind of rest than I'd felt in years. Morning finally came. The world outside had been rinsed clean. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. The sky was a pale gray canvas, stretching endlessly without a break of blue. Elaine was already up by the time I emerged from the bedroom, standing by the window with a mug in her hands, still dressed in her robe, her hair loosely pinned back. There was something timeless about the way she stood there, like a painting, brought to life, unassuming, quietly radiant in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with presence. She turned to look at me and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could take root in a man's chest and stay there. For the rest of his life, we didn't have much planned that day. It was the kind of morning made for lingering indoors, for baking something warm and sweet, for slow movements and unfinished conversations that could drift and circle without ever needing to land. Elaine suggested we go through the attic. She had boxes up there. She said things she hadn't looked at in years. I could hear in her voice that it wasn't just about organizing or decluttering. It was about confronting a past she had tucked away in cardboard and dust, pieces of herself she had once needed to hold on to, but maybe now needed to release. I agreed without hesitation. Sensing the weight of what it meant for her to even bring it up, the attic was dimly lit. The single bulb casting long shadows across wooden beams and uneven floorboards. Boxes were stacked neatly along the edges. Labeled in fading marker, old photos, mom's things, letters, college. Misc, don't open unless ready. We worked in silence at first, Elaine kneeling beside one stack while I opened the lids of others, careful not to disturb what didn't need disturbing. Occasionally, she would pull out an object and pause, her fingers running along its surface. A flood of memory evident in the softness of her expression. A childhood drawing, a dried bouquet, a yellowing newspaper clipping. Each item was like a breadcrumb leading her back to moments long gone but not forgotten. She handed me a box marked simply with her name. Inside were journals, dozens of them. Bound in leather, spiral, fabric, some with bookmarks, some sealed with ribbons. She looked at them for a long time before saying she hadn't written in years. Now she used to believe capturing her thoughts would help her understand them, but eventually she'd grown tired of trying to explain herself to a page. Still, she didn't throw them away. She placed them back in the box carefully, as if preserving them for some future version of herself, who might still want to remember the woman she had once been. One box in particular gave her pause. It was heavier than the others, and when she opened it, her breath caught just slightly. I moved closer without speaking, letting her take the lead. Inside were clothesmen's clothes, neatly folded sweaters, a jacket, a scarf. Beneath them, a photo album and a small wooden box. I realized then this was the box she hadn't touched in the longest time. She sat down, the box in front of her, and after a moment, opened the wooden container. Inside was a watch, a simple, gold piece with a leather strap, worn but clearly cared for. She turned it over in her hands, then set it gently on the floor. "He wore this every day," she said finally, her voice distant, even when it stopped working, said it reminded him that time wasn't something we controlled, just something we moved through. She didn't need to say who he was. I knew. This was the man she had loved before. The one whose shadow had lingered around the edges of her silence, whose name she only spoke in fragments. I felt no jealousy, no threat, only reverence. It was a sacred space she had invited me into, and I treated it as such. She leafed through the photo album, occasionally stopping to smile or sigh or brush her fingers across the plastic sleeves. There were pictures of them together, vacations, holidays, lazy mornings. They looked happy. I could see in her face that looking at them now didn't bring pain, but rather a quiet gratitude. Gratitude that she had loved deeply once, and that she had been loved in return. When she closed the album, she looked at me, not for permission, not for comfort, but simply to include me in the moment. Then she set it aside, folding the box shut with care. We spent the rest of the afternoon sorting what could be donated, what should be kept, what could finally be let go. It wasn't just about clearing space in her attic. was about clearing space in her life. I understood then that love isn't about replacing what came before, it's about making room for what comes next. And she was doing that with intention, with courage. When we finally came back downstairs, our arms full of dust and memories, she looked lighter. Not because the boxes were gone, but because she had finally allowed herself to open them. We spent the evening quietly, side by side on the couch, watching the fireplace flicker and listening to the soft murmur of music drifting through the room. Elaine rested her head on my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around her, holding her not because she needed to be held, but because I wanted her to know she could always lean. We didn't speak of the attic again that night. We didn't need to. It had been a chapter closed, a memory honored, and a bridge quietly built between the past and the present, as the flames dimmed and sleep pulled at the edges of our awareness. I felt her hand tighten slightly around mine. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of something immense. A promise, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement that, despite everything, the years, the grief, the unanswered questions, we had found something in each other worth holding on to. And as I drifted into sleep beside her, I knew with certainty that I would choose her again and again, no matter what came next. The morning after our quiet evening by the fireplace began with a subtle shift in atmosphere, as if the air itself held something unspoken but waiting. I rose early, not because I had to, but because I had grown accustomed to waking with the sun when I was with her. There was a calm to the early light as it filtered into the kitchen, touching the worn wooden countertops and dancing across the soft edges of the breakfast table. I moved about quietly, making coffee the way she liked it. 1 scoop more than standard, just a bit of cream, no sugar. I had memorized her habits without realizing I'd done so. The way she tapped her spoon on the side of the mug twice, the way she always reached for the window latch first thing to open up the morning and let the breeze whisper in. It was these little rituals that had become the rhythm of my days with her. I found myself clinging to them more than I had expected. 2. Elaine appeared not long after, wrapped in her robe, hair tousled from sleep, and cheeks still kissed with the warmth of dreams. She greeted me not with words but with a soft, familiar look, one that conveyed a kind of quiet trust that had taken weeks, maybe even months, to fully form between us. We sat together in the silence, sipping coffee, watching the sky lighten, and listening to the birds announcing the new day. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real. And sometimes the truest moments of connection come not from declarations or fireworks, but from the shared stillness where nothing needs to be said at all. Later in the morning, she suggested we take a walk through the old park near the edge of town. It was a place she hadn't visited in years, she said, not since before her mother passed. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the mixture of nostalgia and sorrow that places from our past tend to stir. I agreed without hesitation, not out of obligation, but because I understood the significance of that request. She was letting me into more than just her routines. Now, she was letting me into her memories, her grief, her scars. That kind of openness doesn't come easily. I didn't intend to treat it lightly. The park was quiet when we arrived, blanketed in the kind of gentle hush that only seems to settle over places where time feels slower. Leaves crunched beneath our feet as we followed a winding path that led through tall trees and past old benches that had likely held generations of conversations and silences alike. Elaine walked with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her gaze occasionally drifting upward to catch a branch swaying in the breeze or a bird darting between shadows. As we walked, she began to talk not all at once, not in a rehearsed way, but in slow, thoughtful fragments. She told me about the Sundays she used to spend here with her mother, about picnics and piano lessons, about teenage heartbreaks soothed by long walks and quiet tears on park swings. Her voice trembled at times, but she never stopped speaking, and I never interrupted. I simply walked beside her, steady and present, the way someone should be when another person is unpacking the past. We reached a small clearing with a pond at its center, surface glassy and untouched. There was a bench nearby, faded and weathered, but still sturdy. We sat together, and for a while neither of us spoke. The wind rustled the leaves, and the water shimmered slightly in response. She turned to me after a long silence and admitted that coming back here had been harder than she expected, that the woman she was now almost didn't recognize the girl who had once run barefoot through this grass. But she also said that sitting here with me, she didn't feel alone in that distance anymore. That somehow, having me beside her made the memories less sharp and more like echo soft, not painful. In that moment, I felt the weight of her words settle deep in my chest, not in a burdensome way, but in a way that grounded me. There was a depth to her that went far beyond her laughter, her kindness, or even her resilience. It was in her willingness to show me the cracks without apology, to invite me into places. That still hurt, knowing I might not have all the right words, but trusting that I wouldn't turn away. That kind of trust is not given lightly. It is built day by day, with presence, with patience, with a kind of consistency that says, I'm here, not just when it's easy, but always. We left the park slowly, her hand slipping into mine with a quiet familiarity that made my heart ache in the best way. As we reached the car, she paused and looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she told me that she hadn't believed until recently that someone would ever want to stay in her world this way. That she had spent years building fences, not just the one I had come to fix, but emotional ones too. Walls she thought kept her safe, but that in reality only kept her isolated. And yet here I was, not running, not pulling away.
Us to stay.
Night, after dinner and dishes and soft jazz playing in the background, she brought out an old scrapbook. Not one she had shared with anyone else, she said, not even her sister. It was filled with dreams, some fulfilled, others abandoned, few still quietly burning in the corners of her heart. There were sketches of gardens she wanted to build, notes about trips she had hoped to take, quotes that once moved her scrawled in looping handwriting. She let me flip through the pages, her fingers brushing mine as we turned each one. It was another layer peeled back, another veil lifted. I realized then that loving her wasn't about rewriting her story or offering her some new version of herself. It was about walking beside her as she returned to the truest parts of who she had always been, as we sat on the living room floor, surrounded by memories and candlelight. I looked at her, not just the woman who had once questioned whether she was worth choosing at 53, but the woman who had since then chosen herself every day in 100 quiet ways. And I knew without a doubt that my answer would always be yes. Not because she asked, not because I felt I owed her anything, but because in her presence I had found something rare, something rooted in truth, in depth, in a shared understanding that age and time and scars only made us more ready, not less. And as the night deepened and the world grew quiet around us, I held her hand and knew I would never let it go. The following week arrived, cloaked in early fall, a quiet turning point in both the weather and whatever unnamed current was moving between us. The days felt slower, but fuller, as if each one had decided to make room for more detail, more depth. Lane and I continued our pattern of existing alongside one another in a rhythm that was increasingly indistinguishable from something that resembled a life shared rather than visited. There was no formal agreement, no grand gesture, or official title placed on what we had become. But the evidence of it lived in the subtle folds of every day, my toothbrush beside hers, my boots lined up neatly by the door, her instinctively cooking just enough for two now, without having to think about it. None of it felt imposed. It all unfolded naturally, like two rivers merging and continuing forward without pause. One afternoon, I was out in the backyard, trimming down the last of the overgrowth that had crept around the edges of her garden. The fence, once the sole reason I had come into her world, stood complete now, sturdy and painted a soft sage green at her request. It blended beautifully with the ivy that had begun to climb it again. I worked slowly, not because the job was hard, but because there was something soothing in caring for a space that mattered to someone you cared about. Elaine sat on the porch swing nearby, sipping tea and reading a book, occasionally glancing up to offer a word or a smile. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so content in such simplicity. It didn't feel like waiting for the next chapter anymore. It felt like we were already in it. As the sun began to drift westward and the light took on that golden forgiving hue that only autumn afternoons seemed to carry, she closed her book and set it beside her. She called out that she had something to show me, her tone playful but laced with a kind of excitement that piqued my curiosity. I washed my hands, dried them on the towel she had hung outside specifically for me, and followed her back into the house. She led me upstairs, past the familiar hallways and rooms that had become almost as much mine as hers, and into a room I hadn't been inside before. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and looked at me with an expression that was equal, parts nervous and proud. Inside, the room had the stillness of something preserved, walls painted in soft gray, shelves filled with framed photographs, dried flowers in a vase, and a large canvas on an easel by the window. It was a studio. Her studio. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender, and the floor was speckled with years of paint, each mark a timestamp of creativity. I looked at her and understood that this space was sacred, part of her life she didn't show just anyone. She walked over to the canvas and pulled the cloth off it. What I saw made me catch my breath. It was a painting not of me exactly, but of the garden, the fence, the light during one of the mornings I had been out there working, unaware I was being observed. It was rendered in soft, impressionistic strokes, but the mood of it was unmistakable. Peace, presence, a man absorbed in a task, surrounded by quiet beauty. It was me, through her eyes, and the realization hit me with more force than I anticipated. She hadn't just let me into her home, her habits, her memories. She had let me into her art, her way of seeing. There was no higher intimacy than that. She confessed that she hadn't painted in almost 2 years, that something in her had gone still after a stretch of grief and disillusionment. But lately, something had returned. A spark. A reason. It's not in grand, sweeping inspiration, but in moments like the ones we shared, the mundane, the real, the silently significant, she said. Painting me, painting us in a way, helped her reconnect with that part of herself she had feared was gone forever. I walked over to her, not needing to say anything. The fact that she had let me see this, share in it, was the kind of vulnerability that couldn't be met with words, only with presence. So I stayed there beside her, holding her hand, looking at a version of myself I hadn't known existed until she painted it. Over the next few days, I found myself reflecting more and more on the way our lives had folded together so seamlessly. There had been no plan, no strategy, just timing, openness, and a willingness to lean into something uncertain. I thought about all the things people say about love, especially later in life, that it's harder, that people are set in their ways, that walls are higher, stakes are bigger. But none of that felt true here. If anything, our age had brought clarity. We knew what mattered. We knew what didn't. There were fewer games, fewer masks. It's just two people meeting each other fully, without pretense. Elaine had begun talking more freely now about the future. Not in grand strokes, but in little things, a trip she wanted to take next spring, the idea of turning the guest room into a proper studio. Whether I thought the shed could be fixed up into a small workspace for my own projects, these weren't declarations. They were invitations. Gentle ways of saying, I see you in the story I'm building. And every time she did, I felt the same quiet certainty settle in my chest. I wanted to be in that story. To one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, a small storm rolled in. The rain tapped the windows, and the wind carried the smell of wet leaves and cooling pavement. She lit candles, played a record, and we danced slowly in the living room without talking, just swaying, moving in sync, the music wrapping around us like a cocoon. In that moment, I realized something else. That love, real love, doesn't always roar in like thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly, quietly building itself in the spaces between errands and chores, between breakfast and bedtime, until one day you look around and realize it has settled into your life so deeply that it feels like it was always there. And maybe that's the real magic of it. Not in how loud it is, but in how deeply it roots. In the way a woman at 53 can look at a man fixing her fence and ask a question born of doubt and hope all at once. And in the way that same man, weeks later, still finds himself looking at her and knowing without hesitation, Yes. Always yes. The final piece of that fence I'd originally come to fix stood like a quiet testament in the autumn sun. Its posts firm, paint clean, and the grain of the wood still visible beneath the soft sage. Tone she'd chosen. It had started as a job, a simple task tied to a transaction and an address. But it had become something else entirely, a symbol, perhaps, or a witness to the quiet blooming of something real. Between two people who had lived enough to know that love doesn't always come crashing in, but instead unfolds like the changing of a season, slowly and purposefully. I stood there that morning with the toolbox at my side and a coffee in my hand, not because something still needed fixing, but because part of me couldn't quite let go of the routine we had built, the gentle anchor it had provided. The fence was finished, yes, but my presence in her world had only just begun. Elaine stepped out onto the porch behind me, wearing one of those soft sweaters that always made her look like warmth personified. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there beside me, taking in the scene, the yard, the trees losing their leaves, the work we'd done, the life we were shaping together. Eventually, she let out a breath, one of those long, unburdening exhales that comes not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. She told me she had spoken with her sister that morning, that they had laughed for nearly 20 minutes about nothing and everything, and it made her realize how far she had come, not just in healing from the things she had lost, but in opening herself again to things she never thought she'd feel. She turned to me then, serious and soft all at once, and said something I hadn't been expecting, that she wanted to sell the house, not out of dissatisfaction or an urge to escape, but because, for the first time, the idea of starting fresh somewhere new didn't feel like running away. It felt like choosing. She wanted fewer reminders of what had been and more opportunities to create what could be. She looked at me, steady and unflinching, and asked what I thought. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know how I felt, but because I wanted to be sure that whatever I said, it came from the same place of clarity she had spoken from. We spent the rest of the day walking through the house together, room by room, recalling the stories that lived in the corners, in the photos on the wall, in the grooves on the floorboards from years of life passing through. It wasn't a mourning, it was a farewell soaked in appreciation. Every doorway told a story, and we honored them without clinging. We packed a few boxes, not out of urgency, but out of intention. Small stack of essentials, keepsakes, things that would come with us into the next chapter. She showed me a small coastal town she had always dreamed of living in. Not too quiet, not too far. A place with a farmer's market and a bookstore and a view of the ocean from the porch. I told her I wanted to build another fence there, maybe plant a garden, maybe fix something just because it would make her smile. She didn't say anything in response, just rested her head on my chest and listened to my heartbeat like it was a promise being spoken in a language older than words. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky dim and the stars flicker to life, a kind of finality settled over everything. It's not the end kind of finality, but the full circle kind. The kind that tells you a chapter has reached its final line and the next one is already waiting with a blank page. She reached over and took my hand, fingers threading through mine, and in that small, grounded gesture, I understood everything. There had never been a moment where I'd made the conscious decision to fall in love with her. It had happened in pieces, in her laugh, in the way she looked at her coffee before taking the first sip, in her stories that always trailed off like memories still being rewritten. And now, looking at her beside me, the fence behind us, the future ahead of us, I knew that I hadn't just fallen. I had landed, firmly, willingly, completely. In the days that followed, the plans came together with the kind of ease that only happens when both hearts are in sync. We found the little town by the water. We visited the property. It had a crooked porch and a creaky gate and a view that stole the breath from your chest. She laughed when she saw the fence around it, half collapsed and wild with vines. "Looks like it's waiting for you," she said. And I nodded because it was. Everything about it was. We made the offer. It was accepted. It's just like that. We were no longer wondering what came next. We were stepping into it. We moved slowly. Deliberately, she painted. I rebuilt the fence. Learned the rhythm of the town, the names of the neighbors, the best place to buy warm bread. Mornings were filled with ocean breeze and laughter, and evenings were a mosaic of candlelight and shared silence. Every so often, she would look at me, studying my face like it held a secret she was still learning, and then she would smile. That soft, knowing smile that said she wasn't wondering anymore if she was enough, if she was still worthy of being chosen. She knew, because I had shown her not in declarations, not in gestures designed to impress, but in the day-to-day presence of someone who had come to fix a fence and ended up building a life, and in the quiet of our new world where love wasn't loud, but deeply rooted. She asked me, again this time not with uncertainty, but with gentle mischief, "Would you still choose me, even now?" I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. I kissed her forehead, held her a little tighter, and we watched the sea together, with no fences between us anymore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.